So, welcome everybody to the first edition of InspiredTV. Yay! And I just want to let you guys all know that this is a dream come true for me because after years and years of being a psychotherapist and a coach and a teacher, I have seen how pain can be a transformative element, and I think that most of us do everything we possibly can to avoid or circumvent pain. But then there are those times in our lives and those experiences that there is no avoiding, that there is no way to go around it. And I believe, and I wanted to show through Inspired TV, that it is the journey through darkness that can actually illuminate our greatest gifts. It can teach us our most important life lessons. And on top of everything, it can lead us to wholeness. And I think it's paramount in order to get there. So I am so honored today that Alyssa Phillips has agreed to join us. Welcome, Alyssa.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and warm welcome to everybody.
And Alyssa is a inspirational, transformational speaker. She's a teacher and a writer. And I wanted you, Alyssa, to actually be the first person that I interviewed on this because I believe that your story is such a power of example for everything that I am talking about and what I believe Inspired TV is meant to be and meant to illuminate. So thank you for being here. Really, thank you.
Most welcome, and that is a very gracious, gracious introduction. And
it's so true. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to ask you, which is sort of what I believe is sort of the motivating factors, sort of the thing that catapults people into the most profound change, which is their darkest moments. So I was curious if you would share with everybody what those were for you. What were the darkest moments or the darkest experiences for you?
Sure, and you're spot on, of course. And I've had a few, and I think it's really important. Kind of backing up before I jump in is for us to speak openly about that. Which is clearly the point of your beautiful show. And yet we kind of intuitively hold back because we feel that in somehow revealing that we've been in these dark, deep places that we're less than, or that we're broken, or, if anybody finds out that the facade that we bring out into the world, it's not a match, and it doesn't match who we think we are. And that's the whole point of these things that come across our path, is to get rid of that ugly vinyl siding that we all carry into the world, and it's really hiding our greatness.
Right.
So what brought me there, and your gracious introduction kind of speaks to it, is I had really two big life events. The most recent, really just a catastrophic medical situation that ironically landed me on the other side of an equation that I had been working in, for over 6 years. I'd been working as a plastic surgery physician assistant, had an amazing life by any standard, loved what I did, loved helping people and caring for people, and was 31 at the time, and all of a sudden landed squarely on the other side of that equation, and was just 6 weeks after running my best time in a half marathon. Tree hugger, kind of granola eating, healthy girl. Runner for almost 20 years, just run my best time in a half marathon, stage 4B, cancer diagnosis of an extremely rare type. And, it was not looking good. It was basically a death sentence. There were less than 70 cases ever documented, and even stage 1s didn't survive. And so, needless to say, it was just this free fall downwards. One day I went into work, and the next day, not only did I never go back, but I was instantly in the fight of my life and had zero kind of warning, you know. So as we're processing all of that and we're getting the name and realizing that, you know, it wasn't going in the direction that usually, you know, it looked really bad. It just kept spiraling. I mean, I was yearning to slam to the bottom, yearning, because it meant that I would stop falling.
Wow.
But in those moments, as I saw the weight on my parents' shoulders and my husband's shoulders, and, you know, the gravity of this just unimaginable situation, you know, the surreal slow motion, you know, this is happening to somebody else feeling. It was compounded by the fact that as I looked into my parents' eyes, I saw familiar brokenness. And it was because we had lost my younger sister just about a decade before, just over a decade before, to something completely unrelated. She died very suddenly while we were both in college, actually, together, from bacterial meningitis. Wow. So one of three girls, the baby is no longer with us. And all of a sudden, the middle child, it's not looking so good. So,
well, I was curious because as you're talking, I'm thinking about, you know, even just getting that, as you call, death sentence.
Yeah.
And seeing your parents and seeing your husband. And, you know, one of the things that I know so many people fear is fear itself.
Sure.
And I'm just curious how you coped with that fear, because I think that most people can't even imagine what it's like to be told, no, seriously. I mean, unless you've been there.
Yeah.
But yet I think we can all relate to those moments where in a second, your life has changed forever. It's just changed forever.
Absolutely.
So how did you deal with that fear and that pain when you got that diagnosis, when you saw your parents, knowing that they had already lost a child? So what was that like for you?
Well, you know, clearly a very painful, broken moment, and yet in that moment, it brings me right back to that space of literally, you know, looking into their eyes. And in that moment, I also realized that if I was okay, they were okay, and that they were pacing off of me. And so they're, in addition to a very, I mean, just, it's the understatement of the millennia to say it was an unclear path forward. I mean, it was kind of over unless proved otherwise. That it obviously stirred up, you know, it triggered a primordial fear, actually, you know, in that context. And I think in anything that big, there is some version of this primordial fear that's triggered. I mean, it's survival. And even on the lesser, which, you know, people are always so gracious of, oh, but my story is, you know, nothing like it. And there are people that, you know, have been through just as much or more. You know, we can't know what that is for somebody else, and I'm the first to say that. But always the loss, the breaking, I mean, it inherently hurts. And it does, to some level, to some degree, trigger that survival of, because something has died. You know, my terminology and in a pivot point once again, because that's what these things are. You know, it's a 180. Life as I knew it, beyond the physical part, life as I knew it was over.
Right.
Done. We have all been there. And there's a quote that I love from Kahlil Gibran, and it's, pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses our understanding. Mm-hmm. And it's so true, and yet it doesn't hurt any less when we're shattered. I mean, I was absolutely shattered, and what's interesting is in that moment, what I knew and yet couldn't fully know, and in moments along the way, is as I just absolutely was cracked open, both, in a parallel along the physical, as the physical being a catalyst, all these kind of layers,
Right.
that it was purposeful, and that my spirit was being set free, and that this circumstance, on some level, and yet a very real level, which I know in my bones, it was ready to. When I lost my sister, obviously just very broken, and would have done anything to change that, and chose to really decide that I had done my thing in life. I had gotten over the big thing, and that I would be better for it, and on we go.
Right.
Clearly never could have imagined what was coming next. But when it was me, when it was my mortality, different ball game. And in those moments, there was literally, it was in the unseen, but it was no less real. There was a fracturing of self. And I, to this day, tangibly know what the words mean, and it's Jesus, of be in this world, but not of it. There's one foot in and one foot out. And it's a precious perspective, but it took me a while. It took me several years to figure out what had actually happened. I mean, I knew I was different, and that I'd been through a lot. I got all that. But I was witnessing it as much as I was living it, and yet we were going at lightning speed. I mean, we were trying to catch up to a freight train that was way gone.
Right.
Yeah.
So how have you changed, and how has your life changed through this experience?
Everything's changed. So, and we hear that, and yet everything's changed. Like, even my biology has changed. So part of my journey was with a stage 4 cancer diagnosis, had a big hurdle to jump just in getting in remission. And in this type, that was just a warm-up for me for back-to-back bone marrow, high-dose chemo and bone marrow transplants, which necessitated a year of what I lovingly call house arrest, because it's dangerous for me to leave the house. So what I realized, and again, I was aware of it, but it took a while to really walk around it and separate myself from it, to really look at it. And try to understand what had happened on a core level, was when they pressed the restart button on my body twice. That there was a restart button on my spirit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and in very good ways, and yet the parallel path that emerged is more than we can get into as far as the details, but so beautiful and so perfect, and it was unmissable, and God knew that I would need that to wrestle with later, but to also anchor myself to. And it was right alongside of it. And part of the bone marrow transplant is that they say, when most people just have the one, they say it's your new birthday, so reborn. And on a literal sense, like, my spirit was reborn, and I was a baby again, like, very unglamorous moments, very crawling, falling, I mean, all of it. And that I really had the chance, and I chose to see it as this, and I saw it for what it really was the restart button to re-choose. I could either sit there and watch TV and check out and feel sorry for myself, and not that there weren't moments where it wasn't hard. I could do that, or I could follow a very strong instinct and acknowledge what I knew what was going on, which was to get busy and to figure out who this person was, and to really look at things. And this space was created for me to do that. A lot of people say, oh, it must be nice, just to have time to stare at your navel and contemplate life and all of this stuff. And, there's a threshold to where, you need to be in life too. But I couldn't help but see it for the cocoon the incubation period to explore the edges of this new self and my old self. There was a tearing down and there was a rebuilding, on a literal level and on a soul level. And that I was going to, if I got the chance to re-choose, I was going to be very deliberate and conscious about what I brought back in. And so this is true for everybody and was true in a very literal sense for me. In the rubble of one life, a new one was born. And that is the whole point. And sometimes if you can just hang on to reaching forward blindly, just in the darkness to the new start.
Right.
This is a new start. I can't see it yet, but I'm going to re-choose. I'm going to restart.
Right. But that's what scares most people, is that uncertainty, because sort of between the old and the new, there's this sort of unknown and this uncertainty. And did you ever have times where you wanted to give up, that you were so angry or so broken, as you said, that were there moments like that in this uncertainty, it was just like enough?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I'm so glad you circled back to the fear and the unknown and stuff, because again, like, just in being totally transparent and totally real, I will tell you that I wasn't angry. I really honestly was never angry, and yet it's not wrong to be. It's I think it's a different side of the coin of being sad and broken, and I think we're all wired to kind of go one way or the other. So it's not inherently wrong to be angry. That can just be kind of that bursting, that pop that helps you kind of move forward, the energy that you need to move forward.
Right.
If we can see it as such. I think, I know it was more the brokenness, and in that there was also the awareness. I mean, frankly, what happened was this huge shift in consciousness. So I was flung out into the middle of nowhere.
Literally and figuratively.
I mean, uncharted waters, yeah. Literally. And I was on one shore, and I needed to get to the other shore, and nobody could tell me how. I mean, I was like the fourth or fifth patient. I was the fifth patient to have the treatment that I had done, like, in the world, as far as I know. So not, 4 of the 5 of us are doing well. Like, that's not a whole lot to go on. And I was literally hanging my existence on that. And in that, I was led to the key to getting through and maneuvering through the space in between, is what I call it. And it's magic. It's magic, and it's terrifying, and it's the whole point. I very clearly came to an edge. I mean, I was leaning out even more than I realized over this abyss. Right. A black, inky abyss, and there was a strong pull. And in those moments, I realized that the call was not to look down. It was to look out and up, and to take a running start and just fling myself off.
Wow. But that takes immense courage.
Well, you also have to, thank you, and you also have to know that the ground was receding behind me, right? So right. Good little go now, because that doesn't look so good. Right. And truly, thank you for that. A lot of it, the beauty and the brokenness, which is a big thing for me to talk about, because it is an opposite, and more than like catchy words or catchy way to be beautifully broken or broken in beautiful ways. It's the truth. But breaking hurts. Mm-hmm. Michelangelo was releasing the masterpiece from the marble. Some of us get chunks off. My marble was slammed to the ground, and it just pure and raw and vulnerable, and I had to figure out what I had been transformed into, and what we're all called to be transformed into. So my experience, to kind of condense the visual, is we're all called to the end of ourselves, to leap out or be pushed out into the unknown, and something else catches us there.
So what was the most, like, in that darkness? Because I know to be true for everyone
Mm-hmm.
that if we're willing, that in that darkness, there's usually an illuminating moment.
Mm-hmm.
A moment that, sort of maybe gives you hope or gives you, some type of, like you said, anchor. So, what was the illuminating moment for you in that darkness?
Yeah, they in story. I love writing and speaking, and it's what you're referring to is the moment of transformation, right?
Right.
It's the moment that begins the
Yes.
transformation, the pivot point. Joseph Campbell's work speaks to that. And any Disney movie shows you that work really well. I love
Yes.
Disney movies. There were several deaths along the way, if you will, and yet not the one that everybody thought.
Right.
You know? So I guess one of the first big one, Dark Night of the Soul, as it's called, was interestingly and perfectly during my last bone marrow transplant. So they were stacked on top of each other, which means they were, one after the other. They were 5 weeks apart. So been through all of this stuff and lots of details we don't have to go into. But I'm almost there and yet so far away. And I'm almost there for maybe. For this is all we know to do. And, it doesn't look great, but the alternative is awful. Right. So at that point, it's interesting because you're part of the process of the medical process is I had the high dose chemo, and then a bone marrow transplant, and then 5 weeks later, high dose chemo, 24/7 for 4 days, and then bone marrow transplant. And afterwards, your immune system just tanks, and with that comes some pretty interesting side effects, and they're different for different people, but it can be, just painful throat sores, and that, you have to have IV pain medication for, or GI issues, because like everything's stopped. So in doing that, I had been through it once before and I knew what was coming, and time kind of stops. I mean, you don't wish it away because you're in this situation where time's pretty precious all of a sudden. Not that it wasn't before, but staring you in the face. And yet, you're not feeling great at all. I mean, understatement. So, you have to stay in the hospital until you're on the contained bone marrow unit, until your immune system kind of makes a blip. Like if your heart was restarted, the blip that comes up. So your bone marrow is the fundamental structure of your body. It's your DNA and, really the divine intelligence of the body that kind of pops up and then has to build itself back up. So that can be, 10 days, 7 days, 14 plus days, and you're in a room with a mask and gloves and nobody can come see you. I mean, friends couldn't, my mom and dad and my husband and things like that, but totally isolated from the world, really. And in those moments, there was such a breaking. And what I realized was, yes, it was tough but there was this whole other thing going on. All the momentum of what we had raced through, and suddenly we're at the end. And I'd been a runner for all these times and been trained to run through the hills, run through the finish line, pump your arms when you got nothing left in your legs, and thrust yourself through. And I'll never forget standing at the line of the bone marrow unit, spiked to fever, 2 a.m. in the morning or something. You have to go in, and I knew I would not be leaving there until my immune system came back up. And it was so much more than just having to be there, and willing myself to cross that line. Cross the line. I'd been trained to do that. I trained myself to do that. And never in a million years did I know what I was really training for. And suddenly this moment is there. And what I've come to realize, I just knew the brokenness in that moment. And really, really beyond, we all think we have a threshold of where we are and, that something won't break you and all of that stuff. And I realized I was at the end of myself, and it was scary. And beyond that, I didn't know. I was in uncharted waters again. And that was the beginning. That was the cleaving of one life and truly the beginning of another. And yet I couldn't have that view, the 20,000 foot view in those moments. And that I wasn't meant to. It wouldn't have broken me if I had known the rosy side, which has had other dark moments since. But I've traveled the world. I've, totally reinvented myself and literally remade myself from the ground up, and having this wonderful conversation with beautiful people like you, and all of these bright spots and dark spots after as I resurrected myself. But in those moments, I couldn't see it. And I wasn't meant to. And I think that's so important, because sometimes, you're literally just hanging on by a thread. You're hanging on to that edge by your fingernails. And just letting go.
It's like you're talking about surrender.
Absolutely. Surrender. And there's a distinction. We all kind of know it, but let me, just for good measure, there's a difference between surrendering and giving up.
Yes.
And it's important to know that.
Right.
For yourself.
So what do you think was your greatest life lesson through this? If there was something that you felt you didn't know before, but know very clearly now that you have some hindsight perspective, thank God, what would you say was that really crucial lesson that you probably couldn't have gotten any other way?
Really everything we've been talking about, and there's a laundry list that expands from that. But the knowing and the really reframing, and yet that word doesn't even begin to encapsulate, but the truth, the realization of the truth of the why challenges come. A lot of people look for the why. Why was I diagnosed? Why did she die? Why did these things happen to me? And the realization is, the worse it is, the better. Because your pole vault is that much further. Your spirit is released that much more fully, really fully, when you just crack wide open and life cracks you wide open. And that it's no less hard, but that is the pressure point that pops it. I use the analogy of the lodgepole pine, which their seeds can only be released by an intense forest fire.
Yeah.
And this was a blazing, scorching forest fire, and my spirit was set free. And a whole new mission, a whole new, you don't go back to just being in the medical world, and it's a wonderful thing to do, and I loved my life, but you don't just go backwards to something like that. I instinctually knew that was the most dangerous thing I could do, which would be a great addition to that is, when you're called forward, go forward.
And that's
led.
Yes. Yeah. And that's exactly, I think, the way that I would love to finish this off is, so I believe a lot of times that these transformative experiences, these life-changing moments, then catapults you into a whole new purpose. That's right. And a whole new way of being. So what do you think this led you to as far as a new purpose?
It's really it's interesting because the cancer part of it, I spent the last 3 years, really being purposeful and conscious about what I am meant to do with this huge thing has been entrusted to me in the form of a story and hard-won wisdom and a precious perspective. And knowing too, being very conscious of the fact that the package it came in is what it is. It was totally necessary. And yet realizing that the cancer part could just kind of go off in one direction, kind of be put in a box. And it was so much bigger than that. Not that that's not big enough, but it was so much bigger than that, and you and I talked about this, is that challenges are the catalyst to our greatness. And there's magic in having no plan B. I couldn't go backwards. It was gone. There was nothing left. And that in having that wisdom in our back pocket, in our awareness, somehow that gives us the courage to stand up on the inside. And really, in a nutshell, what happened was I was plugged back in to who I was always meant to become. But I had to break down to break through. And that in the mess of that came the message with the story and the teachings of, the challenges are restart buttons, and that, then we re-choose and we remake ourselves, and that remission is remission, another mission, and that ultimately the call is to be remade.
So if you were to, when you say message, mm-hmm. if you were to give a message, mm-hmm. what would it be? If for everybody who is maybe where you were or going through some event in their own lives that may be different but as painful, or going through their own breaking open process. Mm-hmm. So now that this has catapulted you into a remission, what is the message? What is the message?
The message is the pulling the curtain back on that the challenges and even the catastrophes and the tragedies are really the opposite of what they appear. So the call for a death in some ways for me was a literal one, and yet it was the call to come alive. The ending of a marriage is the call to step into love of yourself, of somebody else, of a new kind of love. Mm-hmm. The loss of a loved one is not the loss of, it's to transcend the here and now, to realize that they're not gone, they're with you, and expand your awareness. So that would be my take home on the reframing of that, the learning that, the groping through it. I know that I am here to condense that for people, and I should say still here, to condense that for people and to teach them how, because it was such a long journey for me, and a very painful and difficult one at times, and yet was blessed with being led through it and guided through it to then serve with it.
Well, I want to thank you so much because, first of all, I think the power of transparency and the power of vulnerability is in and of itself a huge lesson, because I think there's so much shame and fear attached to being exposed and to being transparent. And one of the things that I adore about you is that your willingness to bring this story forward, as jagged and edged as it may be, is really giving other people the courage to step forward, to step up and say, you know what, regardless of the story, the point isn't actually the story. The point is where the story leads you.
That's absolutely right. And to really, kind of piggyback off of that and answer your prior question in another way, we have to be willing to fall apart enough to be remade. And there's no shortcut through that. And it is absolutely a surrender, kind of in closing circling back to all of the loops. that we were talking about. And thank you for that, because it makes my heart happy to know that, and that it does come through, and that in being stripped through the process, I was stripped of, anything less than just totally open and transparent.
Thank you.
Thank you.